Index investing or passive investing has grown more popular with investors. Even Warren Buffett touts the benefits of owning an entire index like the S&P 500 over the long term. An example of an index tracking ETF is BMO's S&P 500 Index ETF. It's the largest ETF in Canada that tracks this well-recognized and popular index. It provides exposure to the returns of the market cap weighted S&P 500 index at a low cost with a management fee of just 0.08%. This broad market ETF makes for an efficient building block in a portfolio, saving you time and effort while mitigating single stock risk. If you're looking for exposure to the largest and most liquid public companies in the United States, this ETF delivers an easy-to-use solution and instant diversification. Commissions and management fees and expenses all may be associated with investments in exchange-traded funds. Please read the ETF facts or prospectus of the BMO ETFs before investing.
Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that this information discussed today is not intended to be or construed as investment advice. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
The dirty secret is that no one's ever going to get paid back.
People have the shortest memories when it comes to investment.
We just got to get Keith into Bitcoin.
Hey, there's a bubble. Welcome back to Loonie Hour, episode 115. As always, joined by the three amigos. We got Keith Dicker, IceCap Asset Management, Rich Diaz, PGM. Yeah, we got it right. What's going on? Keith, look at that Christmas sweater.
Yeah, I know. It's my ugly Christmas sweater. So if you're listening, I'm wearing my ugly Christmas sweater, which is the San Francisco 49ers, team ugly sweater. And they're not having an ugly year. So we'll get back on the prediction coming up.
It feels like they win every time you don't make a prediction.
I know. It's something I'm very wary about it as well.
But, so you make a prediction this week?
I can do it right now. It's going to be 34-27.
You sure about that? Who are they playing?
A lot of points. That's a lot of points they're giving up.
Yeah, they're playing Baltimore. But they'll score a lot of points against Baltimore, but Baltimore will they'll run it up the middle all day long. So it's going to be a bit of a slugfest on Christmas night, but we'll get through it. Now,
Rich?
It is the Christmas season. I was Rich is wearing his snow shirt,
my snow shirt. I guess I'm the Grinch because you can't see, but my hair looks like I have a little devil's horn.
Is that a new look for you?
No, I'm trying to get rid of this cowlick.
What do they call that? The quaff?
This cowlick refuses to disappear. So anyway, no, I forgot my Christmas shit. I'm a bad person, but I'm ready to celebrate with you guys. And I know Keith, you have something to share with us. So why don't we get right into it?
Yeah, we'll do that. But first of all, everyone else, if you're listening and not watching, Steve looks like, remember was one of the oldest, longest running Christmas cartoons? The Grinch?
Yeah.
The green guy? Steve is dressed like the Grinch right now. He has the green sweater and the Christmas hat.
It's my top 10.
Yeah, he has the typical, Steve Saretsky scowl going on.
Yeah, that's right.
The brooding look. You look good. But speaking of looking good and brooding, because it is Christmas, and some people might be familiar with the Festivus for the rest of us. The Seinfeld theme.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the key themes that the Costanzas used to do, they had the feats of strength. That's where you'd wrestle with each other. But they also had the airing of grievances. And one great thing about the podcast, we chat with a lot of people all the time. And we get really nice feedback and a lot of compliments and stuff like that. And every now and then we'll get a critique. And some of them are good, but some of them are just amazing. So we just received a great critique. And, I just want to read out some of the highlights of the critique. And so this is in line with the airing of grievances. So this person took the time to write us, and I'm just going to hit the highlights. He says, "Your podcast is so awful. Okay. Where do I start with letting you know how shit your show is? You three babbling dipshits. You three clowns." It's actually in line with a lot of stuff.
He's inclusive.
Yeah, he calls us. He said, "You dumb turds," as well. And then he also says he stupidly tunes in every week to watch and pay attention.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you for listening.
And then he signed off with respectfully. So this person took the time and there's a lot more information in there. Give suggestions on what we can do to get better. And it's funny to hear the words where you can chop it up because we're in control of the podcast. We can do that, right, Steve?
That's right.
But we're going to try to get better in 24 at a lot of things.
That guy
So
was
that
really
was-
spreading the holiday cheer there.
He was airing his grievances, and
He's
it
still
gave
doing
us.
an end.
Yeah, I know. He gave us some things to think about, and we'll do a bit better in 24.
I'm
for
just happy
everyone.
he listens every week. So that's nice, despite our despite the babbling
What do you
and
call
turds
us?
that we are.
Grieving turds.
That's right.
He called us a lot of things.
Okay. Well, thanks for listening.
Anyways,
Yeah.
well, speaking of grieving turds, Stephen Gilbo is out this week. Bringing a new EV mandate to Canada. So I'll kind of just note the highlights here for everybody. And so the highlights, so Canada's car makers will be mandated that 20% of their sales are electric or plug-in hybrid vehicles by 2026, 60% of them by 2030, and 100% by 2035. So we're going to get into it rather than pontificate and pretend to be, EV experts here. But I think it's relatively straightforward. Anyone with half a brain, but we do have David Rapson, who's been on the show before. He's going to come on for 15, 20 minutes here and provide some commentary. This is a guy that, again, works for the U.S. Federal Reserve, studying their energy and transportation transition,
Yeah.
the green transition. This is his whole thing. This is all he does, is it not?
Yeah, so he's an expert. He's a PhD in economics. He's one of my friends, and he teaches at the University of University of California in Davis, and he studies the global transportation decarbonization. So this is like a fastball down the middle, right in his wheelhouse. He's literally an expert in sort of the feasibility, the pathway to the electrifying road vehicles in wealthy countries. I mean, we got the expert in this particular subject, who's going to tell us sort of what he thinks about this policy that our environmental czar, and I think that's an appropriate name for him, is going to do in Canada, and we'll we don't know what he's going to say yet. It's like the last minute guest. We spoke to him yesterday late at night and said, hey, do you want to jump on and talk to us about this thing? So here we go. We're going to talk to him in a second, and I'm sure he'll give us some insights.
Maybe Stevie G tipped him off.
That's right. Oh, and I think he's our first repeat guest, which is kind of fun.
Yeah,
so there you go.
Who had that on the bingo card?
Nobody.
That is David.
Yeah, he wasn't. Yeah, Hey, there you go. So we're gonna chat with David here about the EV stuff because I think it's incredibly important. There's going to be obviously knock-on effects, etc. But then we're going to jump over to Canada's CPI numbers that came out this week. We got some update on the retail sales. We've got Canada's population growth figures that came out, which are just mind-blowing. So we're kind of jump into all that, some of the activity here in financial markets leading up to the holidays. And so, stick around for all that. But why don't we jump to David's interview right now? David, welcome back to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, it's my pleasure, guys.
So you were early on the tweet storm there. When the policy was kind of leaked, you had a really good Twitter thread, and that's when I kind of reached out to Rich and said, "Oh, we got to get you back on the show." Since that sort of tweet thread, the official announcement again has come out. So your initial concern was that the federal government might not include hybrids, for example, and it looks like they have included hybrids. Again, so I'm kind of curious your thoughts now that they've included hybrids. I guess we don't have the details yet in terms of like what hybrids are allowed or what is considered a hybrid.
Yeah, so that was one of my many initial concerns, and yeah, it's true that these the details of these policies are still being formulated. It's pretty clear, actually, even from reading the policy itself, which I've since done. It was released after I wrote those tweets. So they are going to be including plug-in hybrids with battery sizes that are large. I think the intent there is to have people driving on the electric drivetrain more than the gasoline component of the drivetrain. I think it's good to include those. I think we need to have as many pressure relief valves to this policy as possible. But you know, the tweets themselves, and I know that you guys also have a lot of skepticism towards this policy. So I wanted to maybe first start by steel manning this policy, because I think it's not like this is a completely idiotic idea. There are lots of reasons why people would want to push electric vehicles, and I don't want to come across as like saying that those don't exist. But I think we need to admit them before then looking at also the other side of, you know, why we might not want these. So the steelman kind of argument for pushing towards EVs is they are the best current technology option for decarbonizing transportation. They just are. They're really promising in that regard. And that's because they emit less CO2 overall on average than gasoline cars. And so that's a benefit. We care about climate change. We care about decarbonizing transportation. This is one way that we can really do it. The extent of this is based on the composition of the electricity sector, right? The extent to which EVs are going to reduce overall emissions depends on how the electricity is being generated. And in Canada, actually, Canada has a really clean grid overall. It's about 60% hydro, which is carbon free. There's an incredible endowment of hydro power and the potential for hydropower in Canada. So Canada is actually a very natural place to do this. It's about 10% nuclear, and it's not very heavy on coal, although, as we'll probably get to, and as I mentioned in my tweet string, that's not true everywhere in the country. In my home province of Nova Scotia, for example, it's 60% coal, and this should be a major red flag. But overall, in terms of steel manning this aspiration in Canada, it's a fairly clean grid. And the grid is getting cleaner over time, and batteries are getting cheaper. So when we're talking about a policy that's going out 12 years, this is actually, you know, there's some degree of, hey, we're going to project that all these other things we're doing to clean the grid and all of these savings that we're seeing from reduced battery costs, those are going to continue into the future. And this policy is going to be, you know, not really a big deal 10 years down the line. That's the steel manning of the policy. Maybe I'll pause there because because next I do, like, there are lots of issues with it that I just didn't mention.
Yeah, I've got a whole host of questions here, which is like, okay, so first one being, he says, okay, but you got 20% of the sales have to be electric or plug-in hybrid by 2026. I mean, that's like 2.5 at this point, it's basically 2 years from now. And I think, what are we running at in Canada? Is it like 10% of new car sales are EV? I don't know the exact figure, but
I can look it up. I can pull it up. It's very low.
So
I'm on the IEA website. So if you give me a second, I can catch up to you guys. Go for it, Dave.
The way that this will happen is through subsidies. And subsidies are an effective way to stimulate demand, but a very expensive way to stimulate demand. And the reason why they're a very expensive way is that the government is not able to distinguish between people who would have bought an electric vehicle in the absence of a subsidy, of which there are many people, right? Lots of people want EVs. They want to signal, they want to be clean. They want to signal that they're being green. So lots of people would buy these without subsidies, but they're going to get subsidies anyway because the government can't tell them from the people who the subsidy is actually, convincing to buy on the margin. So I think
Dave, maybe though they can review, your social credit score, and then they can tell who who will deserve one or not.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe a central bank digital currency might work well here, Rich.
Carry on.
Incentivizing good behavior, but like, I do wonder. Is like, I mean, I drive a Tesla like every other realtor here in Vancouver.
Horror.
I know. God, I'm the worst. I took, but like, I look at that and say, man, I was looking at the other day. I'm like, I think the cheapest EV right now in Canada, and I do agree, like, technology is evolving and it's going to get better and cheaper over time. But like, I think the cheapest EV today is a Nissan Leaf, which, like, kind of a shitty car. It's $40,000. So it's
EVs
like,
are expensive. It's going to be hard to get. So I'm going to put on my American lens here for a second, which I think doesn't quite map to Canada in the same proportions. But just let me tell you how I'm thinking about the EV market in the US. Like everything in the US right now, we've got kind of 1/3 of the population on the left, 1/3 in the center, and 1/3 on the right. And right now, when it comes to EVs, we're harvesting those 1/3 of people on the left. They care a lot about the environment. They're big into all these EV mandates, and they're often rich and they can afford a more expensive car. They're just buying EVs. Okay. Once we exhaust that subpopulation, we're going to get into the centrist people who maybe they're just looking for the best car for them at any moment in time, right? They want the best deal. They're looking, at what services the car offers, what's the price of gasoline versus electricity, that type of thing. And then on the right-hand side of the spectrum, you've got people who are actively politically against EVs because it's been a little bit of a politicized issue. In Canada, I don't know how those proportions break down. How many people, I don't know whether it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, maybe half of the population would buy EVs. They just want EVs. They're willing to pay more for them. And it's not going to take much subsidies to get them to do it. But once you exhaust those kind of ideologically aligned consumers who are wealthy, there really is a question. How do you get people who don't really care about EVs? They just want a cheap, good car. How do you get them to buy it? And I think the answer is subsidies, but time will tell how effective that's going to be and how costly.
But Dave,
So-
I have a
Oh, go
I have a
for it.
question. Yeah. How are they? So let's use the 20% number by 26, right? And that's probably 25 model cars. No, sorry. There was the 27 model cars, right? Because
Yeah.
it's the way
Yeah.
the cycle works. Are they going to police it at the sales level or production plus imports of cars? Like how will, and then if you're not hitting 20% or who's penalized, or is 20% just a target they're hoping to achieve? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, Keith, that's a great question. I haven't seen the details or been behind the scenes in these deliberations in Canada, but my strong sense is they're modeling this after the ZEV mandate in California, which has been adopted also by 10 other states in the US as well. The ZEV mandate has a tradable credit system that is implemented at the OEM level, at the car manufacturer level, where these OEMs, if they sell cars in Canada, they have to either sell enough EVs or buy credits to make the difference. Okay, so for every extra gasoline car they sell, they have to buy a credit from, say, Tesla that's only selling EVs. And the price of those can get very high. So they're kind of, the enforcement of this policy is going to happen kind of from two directions. One is lucrative and expensive subsidies for consumers who are buying, but then this ZEV mandate that is going to be implemented through the supply side, where non-complying OEMs are going to face increasingly high costs of buying these permits if they're not selling enough cars. That, by the way, means that if I'm, Chrysler or Ford up in Canada and I'm trying to sell an EV and I'm one car short of meeting my ZEV mandate threshold, then I'm going to lower the price on that car. Right? I'm going to lower the price on that
and it
car
also
because otherwise I'd have to buy a credit.
But it also should mean that the price of the non-EV cars, like the gas cars, should go up. Like they're going to go up 10, 20%, whatever.
Exactly.
And,
that's right.
And what is the EV opportunity like in the Kitsilano four-door car market? Like if you're in the prairies or in rural anywhere, you can't use those cars to do stuff. Like you need a pickup truck.
Yeah, the performance of the battery. Dave, I'm kind of curious your thoughts. I mean, like in Vancouver here, we obviously have a mild climate. I can tell you, like Teslas are everywhere. They're all over the place. Yeah. And obviously we've got, BC Hydro is we have pretty cheap electricity here. So I think the EV stuff really makes sense in places like Vancouver. But yeah, to Keith's point, I wonder about places like Alberta where, gasoline is relatively cheap and hydroelectricity is pretty expensive over there.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things you mentioned there. One is the climate and one is the relative prices. And, you know, let's start maybe with the relative prices of gasoline and electricity. I wrote a paper that tried to answer this question. We were wondering, how much do people care about electricity prices versus gasoline prices when they decide whether to buy an EV or gasoline car? And it turns out, at least this was a study in California, they care a lot more about gasoline prices. So when gasoline prices are high, people buy a lot more EVs. But what we also find is that that indicates, by the way, that people don't really know what their electricity price is, right? And that might ring true to you and many of the listeners. That's, you know, one of the main things that I learned in the first 10 years of my career is, well, people just, you know, economists have this model of rationality. Well, it requires people being informed. And in this particular dimension, people don't understand electricity prices. They don't know what they pay and how.
I would say that's a very accurate statement.
Yeah. So, and we find that actually in this paper as well, where people who buy electric vehicles in expensive electricity districts, they end up selling them sooner than in cheap districts. So people are learning about how expensive it is. In California, you know, we've got the most expensive electricity in the continental US on average, but there's a lot of kind of variability, which is what we use for this study within California. Anyway, people are attentive to I think upfront, people don't know a lot about electricity, but they're going to learn quickly when they buy an EV and start seeing their electric bill. And yeah, in BC, that might have a very different effect on demand for EVs, where electricity is cheap, than it does in, say, Alberta, where electricity is more expensive. So I think that's really important. And the second thing you mentioned is climate. And I mean, there are just so many stories out there. You don't have to search hard for people who drive Teslas in very cold climates experiencing worse battery range for their car. And this is something that stresses people out. It's probably the most important feature of the car. How far can you go? And yeah, this is something that, for two reasons, is worse in cold climates. One is because the battery has more resistance in the cold, so it takes more kilowatt hours to charge it, and it dissipates more quickly. And the second thing is you have to heat the cabin of your car somehow. In a gasoline car, you do that because of the fact that the gasoline engine is so inefficient, it just casts off a lot of heat. We capture that heat to heat the cabin of the car. That doesn't happen in an electric vehicle. We have to actually draw down the battery of the EV in order to heat the cabin. So yeah, EVs are less well suited to cold climates. And hey, you know, Canada's got a lot of cold climates.
And Canada's
so Dave,
also...
can I jump in there?
Yeah,
Okay,
go ahead. Canada's.
Okay.
I was just going to say that Canada's also not that dense like the U.S. I mean, like you go to, you know, rural Saskatchewan or, you know, rural Alberta. I mean, it's anyways, continue.
Sorry. So my question is just like, you know, at the beginning you said, you know, we're subsidizing people, and the word you threw in, and you weren't talking about me. You were saying we're subsidizing sort of the rich, the early adopters who are wealthier and on average care more about the environment. And to me, that is one of the major philosophical issues I have with this. As with most, or maybe not most, but a lot of climate change policy, you're basically allocating capital from the poor to the rich. And I just find that to say it rankles me would be an understatement. I think it's outrageous, basically, that anyone who is of a certain socioeconomic status is getting any money from the government. And frankly, I don't care what the environmental outcomes are. I think we should be subsidizing poor people, not rich people. I mean, is that a fair sort of criticism, or am I too hawkish on that piece?
Well, I think it's a completely fair criticism. When you look at where the clean energy subsidies have gone in the US, they've gone overwhelmingly to rich people. And that's because rich people buy new cars and new EVs are subsidized. Lower income households are buying used cars and those aren't subsidized. Well, more recently they have become so, but for a long time they weren't. Same with rooftop solar. That was subsidized. Who puts rooftop solar, you know, on their house? People who own their house. Well, rich people own their houses. So economists have written papers estimating these subsidy programs are some of the most regressive programs you could design. And I think it is a deep flaw. We should care about whether these benefits are going to rich people or poor people. And unfortunately, with these policies, it's pretty regressive.
Okay. So one of the comments Justin Trudeau made, and he says, climate policy is economic policy. And I don't think he said that. And I knew I was going to hold on to that one because I think that's exactly right. And I think he's making an economic policy that is fundamentally regressive, e.g., worse in relative terms for poor relative to rich. I think that's number one. But also just philosophically, I mean, isn't this just basically like almost a throwback? And I don't mean to exaggerate, but it is almost like a throwback to like Maoist policy, whereas like we're just banning something, and we're not banning something that's like cigarettes or tobacco or heroin or these things. We're banning something that is extremely useful, and not only is it extremely useful but ubiquitous, and with a hugely long shelf life that and so to me it's just like I just wondering, like, I know this is your expertise and maybe again forgive me for being so hawkish, but just as a philosophy for trying to engender its use, is that the right way, or is that would you suggest that that's a good way to do it?
Yeah, so actually, I had a whole list of kind of points that I wanted to touch on the challenge side of this policy. And the bans versus mandates point that you just brought up is the number one point on the list. So I want to take just a second and tell you why you're right about that. Okay. Think about the types of things we ban or the types of things we mandate. Usually we're banning something that is, nearly ubiquitously viewed as bad, or we're mandating something that's nearly universally seen as good. And those bans and mandates, those are just nudging the final like couple percent into, what is the pro-social outcome, the thing that we think is best for society, or maybe even paternalistically for that person. To ban gasoline cars, for that to be efficient, it would have to be the case that most people, if given the choice, most firms, if given the choice what to produce, and most consumers, when given the choice of what to buy, they would produce and consume electric vehicles. And maybe there's some stragglers on the margin who aren't going to, and that's what the ban or mandate is going to nudge into compliance. But that is clearly not the case here. So first of all, EVs and gasoline cars are not perfect substitutes. They offer very different consumer experiences, both in terms of price, in terms of refueling options, in terms of range, in terms of towing power. Steve, you mentioned, the need in some places for pickup trucks, and these are very different across gasoline and EV drivetrains. So they're not perfect substitutes. And it's completely reasonable to think that 10, 15 years from now, we could end up in a mixed equilibrium where it's still beneficial for some of our transportation services to be met by gasoline cars, by pickup trucks, let's say, that are driving on liquid fuels. And so these bans can be extremely costly to the extent that we get that wrong. It might be the case that we still have more innovation to go, and we're going to have pickup trucks with awesome batteries and electric grids that are cheap 12 years from now, such that everyone would have bought EVs anyway. And in that case, these mandates are not going to matter all that much. What I'm concerned about is the other state of the world, where we don't get that technological progress, where electricity is still expensive, where EVs are more expensive than gasoline cars, and we don't get the same performance out of them either. And some significant portion of the population would be better off in a gasoline car in Canada. And we're going to tell them that they can't do that. That is extremely costly economically, not to mention probably politically. So I think that that's where the danger in this policy really lies. And that's why I think we really need to build in pressure relief valves, safety valves to this policy to mitigate against that risk.
Yeah, it's kind of.
I'm already hearing, from the political side up here that Atlantic Canada is going to be exempt from this new carbon tax. Anyway, Dave, this is a fascinating discussion. I really enjoy it. And I hope people are appreciating it. What's happening? This is a pretty big policy that's going to be. I like to use the word suggested onto us, but it's it's being rammed down people's whatever. Steve.
David, to your point, right? You're talking about sort of, the supply and demand, right? I mean, like the market will kind of normally dictate what they want to buy and whatnot. But, I noticed like, Ford announced a month or two ago that they're cutting production of the F-150 Lightning, which is their EV truck, which is, I think that's, their pickup truck is their best selling vehicle. And obviously they took that electric and that. So it's just not quite there. I was also going to ask you on the infrastructure side, because like I said, I drive my Tesla here in Vancouver. I love it. I think it's a fantastic car. I think they work really well here right now, but I look at it and say, man, the infrastructure, like, so for me, just charge in my strata building here, it was like I had to move mountains to get it done. And it's a small building, and I have the expertise to get it done because I deal with stratas on a daily basis. But it was very
apartment buildings. Sorry,
yeah, apartment buildings. Yeah, it was incredibly difficult to get the electrical infrastructure even put in place because I was like the first EV in my building, and they're like, "Oh God, what do we do?" Like this, And I can tell you, like all these other buildings in BC are having like the same issues, and they're doing like these infrastructure reviews, and then you got to approve it by the board, and then you got to do the upgrades, and then I'm saying this is only with like, I don't know, Rich, again, EVs are what in BC or Vancouver, maybe between 5 and 10% of the total fleet.
I can tell you right now, in Canada, it's 1.6% of the EV stock as of 2022, according to the IEA data, which I'm looking at right now. Just to give you a comparable, in the US, it's the stock of EVs is 1.3. I mean, there are places like Norway where it's much, 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 much higher, but there's 5 million people who live in Norway and they're all millionaires. So it's different kettle of fish.
And I would say, like I said, go ahead.
Yeah, Steve, your point is really important. The infrastructure piece, we haven't fully grappled with it, or at least the people who are designing this policy haven't fully grappled with it. And there are no clear solutions. So one of the, last time I drove into Halifax, where there's a enormous housing shortage, just like there is in most of Canada right now, they've relaxed the zoning requirements for new builds because there's an aspiration to create more housing density, which makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to do that. And so when I drove into the town from, went around the Armdale Rotary, and there was a 40-story apartment building in what used to be a single family home neighborhood. This thing it was really jarring actually to see, but probably this is now going to be filled in around it with a whole bunch of other 40-story apartment buildings. Well, the proposition for EVs is very different if you own your own home and have a driveway than it is if you live in a high rise, just as you mentioned. And even if you own your own home, many homes were not designed to have the power level coming in, from the street that will support a level 2 charger, which will allow you to charge your Tesla in, a couple hours instead of 12 hours.
I can tell you right now, I just have a standard plug because we don't have the infrastructure to do a level 2, and it requires the building to raise money through a special assessment, and then it's a large undertaking, and so nobody's
huge undertaking. Yeah. Somebody did this, a researcher in Berkeley did this, and he owns a small multi-unit in Oakland, and he tried to basically retrofit this to allow for chargers in his basement, and it cost, I forget what the final amount was, something like $60,000, and it took him months of effort to get the permits, and yeah, it's a big deal to be able to do this. So people who live in multi-units, people who live in old homes with who need power upgrades, not to mention just the last mile of the electric grid, these transformers and feeders that are going to the neighborhoods. We're going to be putting a lot of strain on those. Those will need upgrading. We need to think about these costs. It's not as simple as just saying, hey, let's do this. We need to weigh the costs and benefits. And right now I feel like this is much more of a kind of religious or panic decision than it is an economic, the result of some type of an economic analysis that shows that this is optimal.
So yeah, I mean, basically, just to kind of confirm here, that the infrastructure, everyone's going to be driving basically EVs, and everyone's going to basically have an electric heat pump to heat their homes. And again, I just wonder, where does anyone run the numbers on the electrical capacity? And even if you could add the capacity in a relatively short time frame to build the infrastructure, like I said, this guy's saying by 2030, which is it's 6 years from now, 60% of new vehicle sales are electric or hybrid. That's just the lightning quick pace. I just don't see the feasibility of it, and
That
I guess
doesn't matter, Steve. You're just details.
to
People
Rich's
who,
point,
people who,
right? I mean,
people who live in
are the
apartment
people
buildings don't matter. People who live
who
in
are-
apartment buildings don't matter. Let's
Well,
be
yeah,
clear.
exactly. I mean, who are the people that are going to suffer under this? It's ironically the people that he's claiming to help.
Well, that wouldn't
Yeah.
be the first time. I have one more question before, I know we're sort of going over our scheduled time. I mean, is there any idea, or has anyone ever thought of sort of a different strategy instead of a jam this down your throat because we think we're smarter than you strategy, of a pull strategy? So, for example, the government can underwrite the building of, let's say, 1 million chargers everywhere, and instead of telling people that they should buy electric vehicles, just make it super, super, super easy to do so. To own one, and so pulling people into that market rather than jamming it down their throat. Has anyone ever thought about that as a strategy?
Yeah. People, I think there's actually widespread belief that the most dollar for dollar, the most effective way to stimulate EV adoption is through building infrastructure, just as you described. I'm a little bit concerned about that because I don't trust the government to know where these things should go, or to build the right size or the right configuration or technology, and we could just squander boatloads of money doing that type of thing.
Fair enough.
So I'm a little bit concerned about that approach. I think we should be going slowly. I think we should make it real expensive to pollute, because that's what creates the headroom for all sorts of different options. Maybe people go into fuel efficient gasoline cars instead of hybrids, or into hybrids instead of plug-in hybrids, right? Maybe there are little margins that add up to a lot of carbon abatement that would really be valuable. But kind of choosing this particular technology as a winner, honestly, I think we're just going to look back in 5-10 years. I mean, already I'm making bets with some of my more EV optimistic friends about what EV penetration is going to look like in the future, and I'm feeling very comfortable about taking the underside on those bets, because I just think.
Can you introduce me to some of these suckers as well?
Although I have to say, if this is a topic you're interested in, you shouldn't just be talking to me, because I am one of the more skeptical EV people in the environmental economics community. There are people who study this stuff who are less critical than I am about this, and there are a few of them in Canada. And so maybe you should talk to them as well. I'm just one view, but yeah, it just doesn't add up to me. And I think we need to build in safety valves, pressure relief valves. Like, we need to allow for imports from the US. If we're going to, force new EVs, new car sales to be all EVs, we need to be able to import gasoline cars from the US. We need to, have tradable permits, like I mentioned earlier with these ZEV mandates, with price caps, pressure relief valves on the tradable permits, so that we're not killing the car industry. And we need frequent reevaluation of these policies. In 2 years, if we're not anywhere close to hitting the 2-year target, then maybe we should reevaluate. And that's exactly what we just saw in the UK. They had targeted 2030 for some goals, and they obviously that wasn't gonna happen, so they pushed it out to 2035. I think we're going to see that across the board for these very ambitious EV mandates. They're just going to reevaluate when it becomes clear that they're not going to happen.
David, I got one final question just to wrap it up here. But sometimes there's the rebuttal. And have you done much studying on just sort of like how green these vehicles are in terms of like, because you have to factor in the production of, electric vehicles, and obviously, building these or manufacturing these batteries requires a lot of, precious metals and rare earth metals, right? So how green are they?
So yeah, I did the first paper I wrote on EVs was asking that question, looking at the life cycle perspective of EVs from like all the getting all the materials, manufacturing them, transporting them, etc. And let me just say that we were looking at carbon dioxide. We were looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and I think that the battery impacts are much more local ecosystem impacts. They're not global climate change impacts. They're, toxins in the water tables, they're disruption of fragile ecosystems, they're massive evaporation pools for lithium extraction, that type of thing. And those are really hard to quantify. And we didn't even attempt to do that in that paper. But, in California, the EVs, let me see, I think, they're cleaner. They're cleaner if natural gas. So the main question is, what is the marginal source of electricity? When you plug in, what is firing up on the grid? And typically that's going to be natural gas. In Nova Scotia, it's probably coal. When it's natural gas, you're saving some, they're green. You're saving some emissions, and that's good. It's not going to zero because you're burning natural gas. If it's coal, you shouldn't be doing it in a cold climate. You just shouldn't be
You mean
doing
like China? You mean like China?
like China and like Nova Scotia. I'm concerned about, and here it's not even the carbon emissions that are most offensive to me. It's the fact that the toxins that come out of these coal plants kill people. They're going to be killing my Nova Scotian, neighbors who are downwind of these coal plants. And that is, I think it's just unacceptable to ignore the evidence on that is just so clear, and it's been trumpeted from the hilltops for decades. And so to kind of ignore that in Nova Scotia in this policy, I think is irresponsible. And, I really wish that they would reevaluate, at least carve outs for the mandate for the provinces that have a really hard time getting off of coal. I've thought a lot about how to decarbonize the grid in Nova Scotia as well. And it's very difficult to do because you can't get natural gas up there easily. So, they're building the Atlantic Loop, and they're going to try to get a bunch of hydro from Newfoundland. I'll believe that when I see it. I hope it happens, but until it happens, we shouldn't be stimulating EVs there.
Except Nova Scotia, right, Keith?
What should be mandated,
There's
though?
at least 9 votes down here, I think. Nine seats in Parliament. That's what they want.
What should be mandated, though, is that sweater that Keith's wearing, because that is fierce. That's a really nice sweater, Keith.
Hey, thank you for saying that. It's my football sweater.
I take it back now. I thought it was just a Christmas sweater, but it's a 49er sweater.
Well, it's not just
Dave's
a Christmas sweater.
Dave's a Patriots fan, I think, right? You're still a Patriots fan, even though Brady's not on there anymore.
I'm a Patriots fan. It is hard times up there in Patriots Nation. Yeah, difficult.
You guys had a few good years, though.
We had a run, didn't we?
It was a good run. Yeah.
Appreciate this. It's been
Thank you so much.
Incredibly insightful. We highly encourage everybody to give you a follow there on Twitter. We'll plug your handle, and we'll hope to have you on for a third time, hopefully soon.
Yeah, that'd be great, guys. Always fun to talk to you. It would be great if people follow me on Twitter at Rapson Energy. Really appreciate any follows there. I'm going to try to be putting out a little more content on this stuff in the future. So
awesome.
Love what you guys do here. Thanks a lot for having me.
See you soon.
Again.
I thought that was a pretty good balanced conversation there with Dave. So
he's decidedly not a turd. He's wonderful, and we're grateful to have him on. Thank you, Dave.
I have a couple observations, right? So everyone in the preppers world or prepper world, is that what you would call it, Rich?
Yeah,
I know
prepper.
you're
prepper.
leading the charge there.
I'm a prepper.
So,
go for it.
Okay, here's your. I envision a world coming up where if we get to 10, 20, 30, 40, whatever percentage they're trying to get this towards, All of a sudden, everyone is dependent upon the electrical grid to move stuff around. So for you preppers, start stocking up on gasoline and gas cars and just keep them stored, because you know what happens next? Here's the next thing. If I am unfriendly towards the West, and there might be a couple of big countries out there that are, you take out the grid. You do one of those big, whatever they call. There's a movie out about it now. There's Solar Blast or something rich.
Is that on
And the grid-
Netflix?
Yeah, it's pretty bad acting. Truthfully, the plot's a bit.
I saw it.
Yeah,
Saw it.
it's
It was not-
don't.
not-
It, this
not
is
great.
not a. It's Christmas time. You need to watch Die Hard, everyone, not this other one. But to be truthful here, if our electrical grid, and it's going to take on an incredible amount of demand and usage as we go down this path, as Dave suggested, the ability for us to make that grid more efficient or increase the production, I don't think we're going to be able to do it. So if the grid goes down, everyone check out Rich up there at the lake with his gas guzzling car and chainsaw as well.
Chainsaw, more importantly. Hey, Rich, what's funny? The thing about this Gilbo, the most dangerous man in Canada. Remember, we had that conversation. This is a guy that was like anti-nuclear. So he's like, hey, we should electrify everything. Everyone's going to drive EVs and have heat pumps. But he's like, I'm not for. He's like, he's not even for nuclear. He had to be coerced by, he had to get tapped on the shoulder by his own party to sort of go on board with nuclear. So this guy is just mentally not quite there. But anyways,
So I'm
He's
still
a
skeptical
believer.
with
Yeah.
where
Go ahead,
are
Tim.
the Chinese going with this, Rich? Well, what percentage are they trying to get to by when?
Oh, I mean, I don't know the exact numbers for their target. I mean, the Chinese are ahead of the game as far as car exports. Certainly, EV exports. There's a company called EYD that's gone up. But the reality is China's electrical grid is something like 60% coal. And all of their fossil fuel numbers are rising. So again, the percent is increasing from a very, very low base, but their aggregate consumption of fossil fuels is rising as fast as any other country.
I wonder how many people actually think about that though, when they're just like, when they plug in their EV and they feel so good about like the environment, and you plug it in and you're like, it's just tapping into the coal.
Oh my
I mean,
God.
well,
I
I
have
mean,
so
in
many.
Quebec-
Rich, I'm in Nova Scotia. I have so many friends with these e-cars, and they plug it in and I haven't paid for gas forever and I'm clean. You can't even have the conversation. It just blows up. It doesn't work. So
Listen,
again, like even in Canada, if we go down this road, it's like the suggestions that you had there one or two episodes ago. I don't think we put a dent in any of this. I really don't. And it's going to, as you keep pointing out, Rich, it's going to make gas cars more expensive, and it's a tax on lower income households.
That's
So-
a great transition point, because like I said, I just want to emphasize that I live in the city of Vancouver. City of Vancouver's thing is like greenest city in, I think, North America is like their tagline. Like that's like literally want to be the greenest city. And so like I said, these guys are like, everyone is basically mandated to have heat pumps now for new construction. Everyone's going to be now running air conditioning right through their heat pump. Everyone's going to be having EV cars, and you're just like, wow, like it's pretty cheap to plug in your electric vehicle today, but like, what's that going to look like in 7, 8, 10 years from now? So I think this kind of gets to the issue, the larger issue, which is the affordability concerns, right? I think there's a whole cohort of people that are sort of environmentally conscious, and they want to sort of adopt a lot of these policies, but how much are they willing to sacrifice to adopt these policies, i.e. your standard of living? Are you really willing to lower your standard of living for the environment? I think is really going to be the question moving forward. And so that kind of brings us, Rich, to Canada's CPI headline inflation numbers came out this week. So we're still kind of grappling with some cost of living challenges. I think headline inflation sort of stuck at 3.1% year over year.
Yeah. So I think it rose 0.1%. A couple of things we always like to talk about. So, excluding energy, CPI increased 3.5% in November, if I'm not mistaken. So, but as always, it's important to sort of talk about the other important points, which is like what's going on with shelter, which is a big chunk. We know that rent just continues to skyrocket, and we'll discuss. I'm laughing again because it's just the reason I laugh, like, we get some criticism because of my laugh. Number one, I'm a bit like Dr. Hibbert. Number two, it's because some of these things are just like are so obvious. Like we talked about this like 2 years ago, and you're like, hey, this is going to be a problem. And like, yeah, we're smart, but like people who are paid to think about this, they just whiff it either on purpose or by accident. So that's why I find it just so outrageous. But anyways, so core basically rose to 3.5%. Shelter still continues to add a significant amount. We always talk about those three preferred measures, which is the BOC ignored during the pandemic. They're still up in 3.5, 3.4, and 3. So they've come off again from the peaks of the 6, 7, 8s and whatever we had a couple years ago, but are still quite strong. I think the rent is clearly going to be an issue going forward, whether it's politically or otherwise, and we'll discuss why that's such a big deal. But yeah, there's still a lot of inflationary pressure, and I don't think much has changed over the last couple of months. I think we discussed this. Remember, we said it's not going to be transitory, and we argued that we're now in sort of another step level. We were at 2% for a long time. The outrageous stimulus we got, the central bank bond buying, all that shenanigans. And now what the problem is that and inflation expectations have pushed up what I think is like this new steady state of inflation, which is in the 3.5s. So unless you get something to really collapse in the labor market, I think you're going to have that pressure, that number is going to stay higher than certainly what the target is for the BOC.
Yeah, and to add to that point, because I know it's like everyone's funny, like you go on Twitter after the release and everybody just sort of like picks out like the point that they want to like emphasize, right? So you can kind of manipulate the data to show whatever you want, right? And I am always a little bit skeptical that I personally think we've had this massive wave of inflation, but now prices are growing at a much slower. I would argue that they're growing, kind of near that 2% range today, but the damage has already been done. Being that, so mortgage interest costs accounted for 1% of CPI headline inflation. So again, it's 3.1. If you hypothetically were to strip out mortgage interest costs, you're at 2.1. Shelter component is still to your point, is one of the largest drivers. That's rents. Anecdotally, we're seeing rents had peaked, in the summer. There was definitely the seasonality to it, so it's too early to sort of raise the, give the all clear signal, but I think that rents are kind of bumping up against a bit of a ceiling here. So we'll see how that starts reflecting in CPI shelter in the new year. But
it's 7.4. It's still incredibly high, if I'm not mistaken, on that number. I mean, and it was down from 8.1. I mean,
it's still high.
Think about that. Think about that. Like, it's your largest outgoing. For most people, certainly will. I mean, I still live with my mom, but it will be the largest outgoing soon enough. And if that's growing at nearly 7-8%, you're definitely not getting that kind of wage growth. So, anyways, we'll see what happens.
I mean, so right now, so 3.5 is the new 2, right?
Right.
That's where we are. And the whole thing about like rent increases, like I no doubt on an aggregate basis, you're coming up with these numbers. But people who are experiencing the rent increases, that's not what they're experiencing. They've gone from having, 2, 3, 5 years of a lease paying, say, $1,500 a month, and then finally, boom, it goes to $2,200 a month, or $2,500 a month.
Yeah. Yeah, so the turnover rent, so that's the big difference, right? So like turnover, like let's just put this as an example. If you lived in your apartment for, your rental apartment for 5 years, and, typically once you're in there, we have rental restrictions that only allow, a lot of these landlords to raise rents, let's say by 2% a year, 3% a year. So you get these marginal increases. Now, once you leave and you go to find a new apartment, or maybe your landlord decides to sell and you have to go and find something, the turnover rent, the market rent is not $1,500 now, it's like $2,300. Right. So it's like, well, now you're facing that large one-time increase. That's where you're still seeing like the huge gap. But in terms of yeah, the turnover rents are still quite high.
So I have a real stupid suggestion, and everyone is going to say, "Oh, Boomer man, that's really stupid." But wouldn't it be great if this could happen? It would never happen. Everyone involved with policy making on the government side, central banks, as well as, in all aspects of government, for them to really appreciate what lower income households are experiencing, how about for 1 year, everyone, their compensation is reduced to that level? And it's, yeah, I know it sounds a bit funny. Yeah, that will never happen. But again, to appreciate what it's like to really, hey, try and decide what you do with that extra $50 at the end of the month. Unless you're in that position to experience it, you don't know what it feels like. So with central bankers making these comments and making policy moves, and with this new EV policy coming out, which is absolutely going to make it more expensive to buy any kind of car, regardless of what kind of rebate that you're going to get. You got to be in those shoes, to be in that desperation mode, to really appreciate, yeah, maybe we should do things differently here.
So there's an article actually came out today from Bloomberg, and it said it was a poll done by Nanos Research. And so it said 53% of Canadians said their personal finances are worse now than 8 years ago. And for people that are aged 35 to 54, 61% said they're worse off. So, you can obviously see that people are just falling further and further
From
behind.
8 years ago.
Yeah.
Really, from 8 years? That's
come on!
that's-
Don't.
And
start
I
with
didn't
that.
write the article. It's from Bloomberg, which I think Bloomberg is a pretty, it basically just, I mean, the headline says most Canadians say their personal finances have worsened under Trudeau. And so this says poll shows cost of living is now the most important voting issue. So again, just to reemphasize, cost of living is considered the most important voting issue today. And I think that's why you have, the Conservatives are taking advantage of that feel, right? Which is like, that's why the polls are doing what they're doing, because like that's what they're doubling down on. And so I have to, like, Rich, to your point, I mean, I think this kind of like emphasizes everything that we've talked about for the last couple of years. Is we just had a report from StatsCan showing Canada's population was estimated to grow by 430,000 people in the second quarter. So, or was it third quarter or second quarter? No, I think it was the third quarter. Anyways, it was the highest population growth and in highest population growth rate in any quarter since the second quarter of 1957. So, by this account, you're going to grow your population this year in Canada by 1.3 million people.
Yeah.
Where are they going to live? This is like this is why your rent and your shelter component of inflation, right? It's sticky. It's staying pretty
Steve,
elevated.
how many new units will be produced in Canada over the next 12 months?
Yeah, so based on so there's two things. You have housing starts, which is like when you start the construction, and then you have housing completions. And so they're two different numbers. You can argue which one you should use, but like regardless of which one you use, they're going to show you a pretty similar number, which is we're going to probably have about 220,000 homes being built. So again, you're bringing in 1.3 million people, you're building 220,000 homes. It just
So 4 people per home, if you want to use that,
yeah,
or 3.5, maybe you break even. But then you also have the current stock that's looking for inventory and supply. And I don't think it works, guys. What about the education side? How many schools are being built?
Household composition.
Oh my God.
Household composition is kind of average at about 2.5. So they say, like, on average, based on the stats that we have, is like you have 2.5 people, living in a home. So, Keith, to your point, right? We're asking 4 people to live in a home right now. So BMO economics team, and Scotia's chief economist Derek Holt put out some pretty scathing reports after those numbers came out, which again, for these mainstream economists at these big Canadian banks to come out, anti-immigration or anti what this population growth is fairly unusual. But BMO estimates that given the current rate of population growth, Canada requires 170,000 new housing units every 3 months. So 170,000 every 3 months. Like I said, we're building about 220,000 for the year. So we're not even like, this is gonna just, at this rate, you won't have a middle class by the end of the decade.
I just need to correct you. So no one is anti-immigration. People are pro having a plan, and
Totally.
I think that's ultimately the main criticism here. And I think that there's two things I think it's really, I think, that are really negative. So one, I think it's going to actually stoke anti-immigration sentiment, which I think is bad for Canada in the long run, because again, it's good to have immigrants. But I think if you just basically put on the gas, ignore anyone, and criticize anyone who suggests that perhaps maybe we should slow it down to a little bit, I think that's gaslighting on a level, and I think it's going to really stoke anti-immigration. The other thing I think is really important to remember is, like, there are certain industries that absolutely benefit from this increase in population. And it's I tweeted about it earlier, and it's these oligopolies. It's companies that benefit from basically an increase in nominal GDP, and you all know who they are. It's grocery stores, the banks, telecommunications companies, to a lesser degree maybe energy. But these companies, they don't necessarily improve on when you're purchasing stuff more on per capita basis, because we know that the retail sales per capita is declining and or flat. They definitely benefit when the aggregate number of people or the aggregate footfall increases. And it has a double sort of whammy, because it, in my view, presses wages. Now, there's people who argue against that view, who say I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure that it does. And that's the thing. So it's who is this policy helping? Who is this policy hurting? And I just think it's frankly outrageous. And the irony of all ironies is that in 2000s, Bernie Sanders, who's very much a left-wing guy, argued that these sort of open border mass immigration policies designed by and catered to the Koch brothers. And if you're not familiar with the Koch brothers, they're like a hyper right-wing group of billionaires in the United States. And it just, like, the irony is, it just drips with irony. I don't know what else to say about it other than just cry, basically.
Well, just to give you like a little bit of food for thought, as I put this tweet out, right? I said, hey, listen, like, this is nuts. 1.3 million people, 220,000 homes, and this isn't the first year it's happened either. And I had this like Vancouver city councilor guy. He like replies back to my tweet, and he goes, I think your numbers are off. We're at 465,000 people. I said, well, Mike, he didn't even know their own numbers. I was like, this is a guy that is responsible for approving new housing supply. This is the guy that is responsible for approving new housing. And he doesn't even know the numbers that are coming in.
But he also called us three babbling dipshits and dumb turds.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, though, I said to him, I says, respectfully, I'm a little bit concerned that as a policymaker, you don't know your own numbers, because you're missing by a wide margin. Of course, he was referring to, I think he was getting confused, the net growth of the country, which is 1.3 million people. So minus all your births, your deaths, whatever, 1.3 million people is what we added. And he's looking at permanent resident targets, which are set by the federal government. But as we know, that most of the growth is not coming from permanent residents. It's coming from non-permanent residents, aka international migration, people coming here on student visas and everything, and then ultimately staying. So anyways, that's the
I'm shocked, though, Steve, that this has not become priority number one at both the federal and provincial levels for governments, because it is a significant driver and igniter of so many problems, like aggregate inflation that's happening, the housing problem. I saw the other day for healthcare, Canada, I don't know if this was for a specific province or just in general, but the average or median wait time at ERs is at the highest it's ever been recorded in Canadian history. And again, we're considered to have one of the top healthcare systems in the world, and it's taking longer and longer than ever just to see someone. I mean, and the root of all this, everything's about supply and demand. So this, again, anyone listening to this that might be at the provincial or federal level, we'd love you to come on and explain to us how it's gotten to this point. It was kind of irrelevant because you can't fix the past, but what is your plan going forward? Because everything is being affected by this.
So I actually asked the mayor of Vancouver about this maybe a couple months ago, and I said, hey, we're at this like housing event, and I said, what's your conversations been like at the federal level? You're obviously engaging a lot with the different levels of government to try to fix this housing crisis. And I said, did you ever ask them, or has there any been dialogue about the levels of population growth? Is that of concern? And of course, his answer was the standard policymaker response. Oh, no, we need immigration. Immigration's good. Like we just need to build more housing. And I was like, that's not the point I'm making. The point is like you're adding 1.3 million people, or even like whatever you call it. Let's call it 1 million people. Nobody has the ability to build housing to accommodate that. You can't just ramp up new housing starts. You can't get that many skilled trades. You just can't. It can't be done. I don't care how much you can rezone all of BC, you can rezone all of Canada to build, multiplexes. Good luck. You're going to be capped out. And so it's just not sustainable. And everybody sort of skirts around, oh, I don't want to be looked at as like anti-immigration.
So the ultimate irony here.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. So at the Bank of Canada, the security guards and security personnel have gone on strike because they need more money because the cost of living has gone up for housing and food and everything.
Hey, at least they got tampons in the men's bathroom.
Shoot. Oh boy.
Oh
Shoot.
dear.
Oh dear.
This is the problem. We got a housing crisis. We've got the worst inflation in 40, 50 years. The cost of living issue is magnifying. Food banks are lining up around the corner, and
our priorities aren't straight.
What's going on with the priorities here? We're talking about mandating EVs as if that's just gonna, again, we talked about at the beginning of the show, is just who's it hurt the most? It's people on the fringes, and I don't know. It's unbelievable. I don't know who's running economic policy in this country or what the dialogue is like behind closed doors, but man, this is just a total cluster.
I just wanted to point. I actually couldn't hear you guys because for some reason it cut out. But I think it's important to like highlight that we're not the only ones with these views. And Bank of Canada actually published a demographic demand sort of not forecast because the data is sort of backward looking, but sort of demographic demand, and they compared that to the housing starts, and which we'll share on the pod, and it'll show you sort of the massive gap opening, and with no real impetus to close that gap. Anyways, it's kind of sad and frustrating, I would say.
So we'll get more, I guess, of a view tomorrow. We're recording this on Thursday, so if you're listening to this, go ahead and look at Canada's GDP numbers, which are coming out here on Friday. That will give us a decent indicator of how Canada's doing, how the economy is doing. Again, I would encourage people to look on a real per capita basis. Note that we've been declining for 5 consecutive quarters in that nature. So we'll see what the numbers look like. Obviously, that's going to give the Bank of Canada more clues as to what their next move is going to be. Keith, I don't know if you have any comments on that. One of the things, I know we're kind of running short on time here, but I am kind of curious your thoughts on what's happening in financial markets right now as we head into, Christmas and the new year. It typically can be a little bit more of a volatile time, but there's this view out there from a guy like Jim Bianco, who I have a lot of respect for. He's really big on Twitter. He's been very, very accurate throughout the last couple of years during the pandemic of saying, hey, listen, like we're in this new economy now where the way we sort of measured the old economy, it's changed because, people are now working from home. COVID just changed life for a lot of people and how the economy is running. And so he's of the view that markets right now, the Fed is kind of forecasting their dot plots 3 cuts. Markets are pricing for 6 cuts. And he's of the view that like we're going to get this no landing, no rate hikes or no rate cuts, sorry, because he thinks we're actually in this like no landing scenario where like the economy in the US at least is doing totally fine. And everybody's so bearish and looking for the recession. And he's of the view that things are just going to kind of just take off and they're not going to be bad. And so I'm kind of curious to hear your opinion on that, because I think it's a pretty alternative view to what we're hearing in general, which is everyone's, like I said, waiting for the recession, waiting for the rate cuts. And are they coming? I don't know.
So we have 2 views, right? So you have that view by Jim, is no landing, which by the way means economic growth continues to do really well. Now, that's just for the US. Everywhere else around the world, data continues to get a bit sluggish, including in Canada. We had a bit of a negative payroll print this morning that we won't go in a lot of detail with, but it was a big number. And then you have the other view, which is that, hey, we're going to hit a pretty hard landing, which means a deep recession coming up. And this is based on the US. So those are 2 exact opposite expectations. And so then you look at the market right now. So the bond market is telling you, yeah, we're going to get a pretty big recession coming up. It's going to go. Did you hear that, Rich?
Nope.
Nobody heard it, but he's clapping his hands,
microphone's too
everybody.
good. That's amazing. I think the microphone just like the muted
Did it
you
really?
automatically. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Let's try it again.
No, can't hear it.
Nope.
So
Amazing.
anyways,
That's
this babbling turd is clapping his hands right now.
you 3 clowns or something like that. Okay, yeah. So the bond market is though indicating that we're going to hit some pretty bad times. The stock market right now is telling you the exact opposite. It's 1999 again. And so one of these guys is wrong. One of these markets is wrong. So if we do not hit a recession, and Jim is correct, the bond market is going to, using the 10 or 30 year, the bond market is probably going to decline, 20-40% over the next 15 months, right? That's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
If the bond market is right, then equity should be coming off, really hard. So at the end of the year, liquidity, is less. You can get a lot of big capital movements that can really shift the markets. But I wouldn't hold what's been happening in the last week with markets. Certainly don't use that to forecast what's going to happen now in 24, because when January 2nd rolls around, then all of a sudden you're going to figure out, okay, what's going on here. But again, Steve, like, it's such a great observation you're making. You have this enormous division or a separation in views. Where's the market going to go? You don't have this small leeway one direction or the other. And be careful out there,
Rich, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Keith did a really great summarizing it. I think maybe just sort of what might be the driver of growth going forward in the US, for example, is sort of the resurgence in the housing market. We've talked about that. And also sort of the stickiness in CPI. So
do you really go ahead.
Go ahead.
Do you have a resurgence in US housing right now? I think I was looking at like resale, home sales are at like the lowest since 2010.
So it's fair to push back on that, but I think it's also important to note that mortgage rates, remember, long mortgage rates in the US are 30-year mortgage rates. So that number has fallen by 1% over the last, I don't know, it feels like a week, but it's probably been more like a month or so, or 2 months. And you have sort of the rate of change in private gross fixed capital formation and residential. That's now positive. It peaked in June of 2022. It bottomed. Peaked in June 2022. It bottomed in June of 2023, and now is starting to rise again. So the year-on-year change is positive. If you look at a level terms, it's positive. Consumer confidence has bounced over the last 3 months. We're moving in the right direction. Personal consumption expenditure in real terms is 2.2%. Not fantastic, but certainly not bad. National Federation of Independent Businesses, so small business surveys, their compensation plans have actually re-accelerated. You have wage growth in America that's 5%. And that, who knows if that follows the compensation plans of the NFIB back higher, people feel good. Then there's the wealth effect of the stock market. I think I just saw something in the Daily Shot the other day that said more people as a percentage of total Americans own the equity market than ever before. So again, I'm that's the case I'm making for sort of the Bianco argument. I'm not in that view, but I can sure as hell defend it because I think that's what being a good strategist is all about, trying to put yourself in a different perspective. But so yeah, I think that but that's why, in a sense, it's sort of be careful what you wish for. I would say to the Biancos of the world, because if you do get that positive impetus from the economy, all those cuts are going to get priced right out, and all these long duration assets that did super well over the last little while are going to, in my view, massively retrench because we don't have the earnings growth. So that's sort of, that would be the
one thing I like to try to one thing I like to try to reconcile here is, we had Powell with his very dovish presser and Fed meeting from, was it last week or the week before? And people are forgetting 2 weeks before that, he was incredibly hawkish. So, and again, this is not getting a lot of conversation out there, but he did a complete 180 over a 2-week period where there was no data coming out to suggest one thing or the other. And so again, that tells me that something is a bit odd out there in the marketplace. And by him talking that way, it's effectively he cut rates without cutting rates. Because when you get a, you get a, easing in credit conditions and stuff like that. So, it always feels great when, there's a risk on taking place in markets because, hey, it feels good. But again, this has been an odd, couple of 6 weeks and the last 2 weeks. And we'll see where we go here coming up. I think just for the GDP number coming out tomorrow for us, but today for everyone who's listening. Hey, Rich.
That's right.
Yeah, thanks. The expectation for year over year is 1%. So the number and for the month over month is 0.2. So again, the number tomorrow, it should be okay. So we will see where we go with it. And there we go, guys. There she was.
Should be okay when you have 1 million people coming in, pushing that number up. But anyways, I think that's a good place to leave it. Merry Christmas to everyone listening to the show. Hopefully you guys have a good holidays, and we won't be skipping a beat. We'll be back next week to entertain you throughout the holidays, but you guys as well. Keith, Rich.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, boys.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Happy holidays. See you next time.
See you later, you babbling turds.